Hello, I'm OK Carter. I'm here at Arlington Cemetery, the one in Arlington, Texas, not the one in Arlington, Virginia, although they're both about the same age. Well, welcome to Arlington Time Capsules, and yes, this little 10-acre cemetery is on the State Registry of Historical Places. Here's proof. Okay, confession time. I don't think most cemeteries are actually historical in the context of something significant happening at the location. Say, a big shootout or a cataclysmic tornado touching down. Cemeteries usually become famous not because of what happened at the location. It's because the people who made history are buried there. We're sentimental about these people, most of them anyway, and that makes this kind of cemetery historical. It's quite possible you lived in Arlington for years and never knew this cemetery was here. So where is it? It fronts Mary Street, running north and south between 2nd and Mitchell Streets. Think of it as a block west of Collins near downtown. In the old days, it was on the edge of town, right outside the 1894 city limits. So who's buried here? Well, we've got 11 mayors here, including Arlington's first mayor, George Finger. There are numerous postmasters, a plethora of important pioneers, a couple of generals, statistically unbelievable number of colonels. I think it might be a southern thing. Veterans of every war since the Civil War. There's a famous newspaper publisher here, and a smattering of celebrities like actor Morgan Woodward, veteran of 30 films and 300 TV shows. As you walk through and read the markers, you'll see names like Cooper, Matlock, Collins, Bowen, and you'll realize that these are the people the city's oldest streets were named after. All collectively, there's maybe 2,000 people here. I know you might think, well, I think I'll just go get a tract from my family. Well, it's probably, unless you're an old guard family, it's probably a little late for that. This area is really several cemeteries. They all run together. Collectively, there's been a cemetery here for more than 135 years. It's difficult to determine what's what. So let's start with the oldest part, the smallish McNatt family section, also part of what we'll call Old Arlington Cemetery. This is one of the McNatt people right here. To find the old part of the cemetery, enter the cemetery on the south and drive until you stop at this fence. You saw me talking on it a moment or two ago. The oldest part is inside the fence. There's a gate. Let's go on in, shall we? William McNatt came to the Arlington area in a covered wagon in 1872 with a wife and 8 children. It must have been crowded. At the time, the community was called Hayterville. That was located right around where Collins and Abram are today. No longer exists. Well, McNatt made the right decision coming here. He prospered. He was the owner of the first mercantile store. He had a saloon, and he had a farm. I'm sitting on his farm right now. He discovered a couple of small graves in his farm on the corner of it. These were probably early pioneers. Their graves were wood and unmarked. Their identities have been lost in the tide of Western expansion. But at any rate, in 1883, he started his own family cemetery, which eventually grew. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. The oldest readable grave marker is that of a baby, M.L. Cooper, 1874. It's actually right in front of me here, just not very easy to read. This is the big Cooper family marker. McNatt clearly began allowing other families to use the cemetery. He finally just sold the whole tract to the city in 1898. The part people drive through to get here is the new Arlington Cemetery, although it has graves dating to the early 1900s. If you happen to be keenly observant, you may have seen a small group around 40 graves with very similar markers as you drove in. That's the old Masonic section of the cemetery along Mary Street. And finally, at the north end of all this, you'll see what looks to be part of the old cemetery, which is actually the 17-acre Parkdale Cemetery operated by Moore Funeral Home. The older section I'm in right now, Arlington Cemetery, was for many years taken care of by a cemetery association. But now the Arlington Parks Department provides maintenance for it. So every cemetery, of course, has stories to tell. For example, there's the first mayor, George Finger. Now, he's been gone for 121 years now, but people are still dropping by. He had a short life, unfortunately. Died when he was 46. But as mayor, Finger in 1884 replaced the legal system. Essentially, at the time, it was a semi-vigilante group called the Regulators, with the town's first marshal. and he was the main author of the city's original 12 ordinances. Among other things, they banned wearing a gun, wearing a dirk, or bringing a cane sword into town. One ordinance required modest dress. This was aimed at the saloon girls in the city's 5 saloons. Another prohibited riding a horse into a house. I don't know what that was about. And he made a law that if your horse, dog, or cow died in town, you must dispose of the carcass. And he set up an occupation tax to fund the city. You always have to find new ways to fund your city taxes. I mentioned earlier that there are all kinds of people in here that streets are named after: Cooper, Bowen, those kinds of people. Sometimes street naming itself is a kind of an interesting process. We had a doctor here, a prominent doctor named Dr. Milton Cravens in the early 1900s. His wife, Betty, died, so he buried her here. Her marker is right behind my left shoulder. A few years later, he remarried a woman named Mary Carlisle. Unfortunately, maybe 20 years after that, she also died. So the good doctor ended up with 2 wives here in the cemetery, kind of side by side. He figured, given that he'd be visiting here often. The problem was that the path to the cemetery from his house on East Main Street was not very good, so he used his farm implements to widen it, to make sort of a road down to the cemetery. Immediately, of course, the town people started using it, and it became Mary's Street, and then it was shortened to just Mary Street, the entire cemetery now. Well, it's easy to find Mayor William Rose's grave in Arlington Cemetery. It's directly under the biggest oak tree in the cemetery. I'm guessing this thing's maybe, what, 250 years old or so? Rose was mayor from 1919 to 1923. He was the first politician to figure out that Arlington might grow more than a mile square. So he started annexing new territory. Even he was a builder, so he started building new houses outside the original city limits. He had the first sidewalks built. He started the first city audit. But he's most known because he wanted Arlington to have a freestanding post office. So he applied to the post office, but they told him the city just barely missed having a large enough population to warrant having its own building. So allegedly, he told the post office they had made a mistake. They had not counted the most recently annexed area, which had another 300 or so people. What he didn't mention was, I think, was that the newly annexed area was this cemetery. Hey, but it made the city big enough, and they ended up with the post office. So as I say, there are a couple of thousand people, maybe a few more than that, buried here. Each has their own story. The city's Landmark Preservation Commission is in the process right now, with the help of a very energetic college student from Tarleton, to map out the entire cemetery, give the little streets names, to list the location of every grave that you'll be able to find on an app. And the app would also include histories of some of these more prominent figures. And I think the Landmark Preservation Commission hopes over time that people will add their own stories. So if you get a chance, drop on by the cemetery. It's really a very sort of bucolic, country-like setting in the midst of a very large city of Arlington. And take a walk with our old friends who made the city's history.